The burden of being a graduate of ISI will always be on your shoulders.
Hello. Just few days back, I got my ISI Kolkata's MSQE degree, and I will give you a bit of footage from that convocation function. Now, obviously, I have edited few things here and there, and I have tried to trim out the things which won't add any value to you and your time. But I would urge you to watch this video completely, because this would be very inspirational in nature, and it contains a lot of knowledge about life, statistics, and ISI Kolkata. So if you are interested in any of the things, then you must watch this video completely. The part of the video where I get the degree is towards the end of the video, and this video mainly contains speeches, or rather I should say talks, by Bibek Debroy and Professor Peter J. Bickel. Professor Bickel is professor in statistics from UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and Bibek Debroy is chairman of Prime Minister's Economic Council, and he is also the president of Indian Statistical Institute. So the talk given by Vivek Debroy has a lot of reference to our scriptures, and you would be highly enlightened to know that there is so much of depth in our scriptures. I mean, you should not think of it as dogmatic, you should think of it as some fresh insight into the same things which we overlook. And Professor Peter Bickel gives you a kind of history on statistics and what is the future of statistics. And in the course of his talk, he gives you how to think statistically. And I remember in one of my live sessions, someone had asked me how to think statistically. So that portion could be beneficial for a lot of people. Obviously, I would like you all to watch each second of this video. But for the people who still do not want to watch the entire video, I have given you timestamps in the description box of this video. So you can go to those timestamps and click on those timestamps to go to the specific sections of the video which interests you more. So without any further introduction to this video, let's just start the video. This is the academic procession led by the dean. They are entering the convocation hall, and shortly the convocation will start after this. This is our main entrance of the ISI campus, and this is the big banyan tree. Now this banyan tree is kind of hidden because of our convocation happening on the same place. These are a few locations in our campus. This is our part of the campus, kind of very old campus. So you have a lot of buildings which are not in use. This is a kind of very small fountain near our main building. And you have the sculpture of our founder, Professor P.C. Mahalanobis. And this is the lift view of the ISI campus. And this is what people strive to get into. We have football grounds, a small hospital. Then in the passage to the academic building, we have a lot of photographs. Campus has a lot of ponds And yes, the ponds are not very clean, but they certainly have ducks in it. It's quite beautiful campus, small beautiful ISI campus.
I declare the 55th convocation of the Indian Statistical Institute open. It is the 55th convocation. I am no mathematician, but the number 55 is special in many different ways. It's the sum of the first 10 positive integers. It is a Fibonacci number. It's a triangular number. It's a doubly triangular number. It's a square pyramidal number. It's a special number. All numbers are special, but the number 55 is more special. The ISI is also extremely, extremely special. It is the only institute of its kind, not only in India, anywhere across the globe. And when you pass out, you carry with you that burden of expectations in terms of what you're expected to do as students graduating from ISI. It is difficult to date. Not difficult, there are many different ways to date the birth of ISI, but in some ways it can be dated to 1931. But in some other ways, it can be dated to the year 1921, because 1921 is in some ways when the seed of ISI was sown. What am I talking about? I am talking about Professor Prashanta Chandra Mahalanobish's work on the Anglo-Indian community of Kolkata. But 1921, exactly 100 years ago, gives us a sense of deja vu, because in 1921, the world was recovering from the impact of the Spanish flu. Information then is not what it is now, so we don't know that much about the Spanish flu, but subsequent research has shown that the Spanish flu left lasting impacts in terms of what it did to human development. And COVID and the resultant lockout and the uncertainty associated with COVID is still in the midst of us. A little while ago, we heard a mantra from the Rig Veda, Sangachwadhang Sangvadodhang, and it also said, Samani va akuti samana hridayani va. And all of us are united in our inclinations, all of us are united in the wishes in our hearts that this uncertainty due to COVID and the lockdown should pass. By any possible metric, India has fared reasonably well, especially in comparison with other countries in the world, particularly if you normalize for population. Yes, there is still uncertainty. Yes, we do not know about, we as statisticians, you do not know, you do not have samples to know about the efficacy of the vaccine. You do not have information about what will happen to a virus that mutates. In terms of economic indicators, there are signs that the economy is recovering, but in some ways, the effects of the lockdown are still there, particularly in sectors where there is a human-to-human interface. Hence, when you go out into the world, when you pass beyond these portals, the world is still one of uncertainty. Usually, in customary usage, we do not distinguish between the words risk and uncertainty. But ever since Frank Knight, economists have distinguished between risk and uncertainty. Risk is a situation where at least you know the probabilities of events. Uncertainty is a situation where you do not know what the probabilities associated with various events are. Had you graduated 2 years ago, you would have confronted risk. Today, as you graduate, you confront not risk, you confront uncertainty. To the best of my knowledge, the first recorded convocation address anywhere in the world is from the Taittiriya Upanishad, the Taittiriya Samhita. And I hope someday you read it, because the Shiksha Valli section of the Taittiriya Upanishad almost takes you through entering an educational institution and graduating. The first Anuvak is like an inaugural event when you join a program, then you go through the course structure, and in the 11th Anuvak, you have the teacher addressing the student almost in a convocation address. You're familiar with some of these terms, you may not know where it is originally from. Matri Deva Bhava, Pitri Deva Bhava, Atithi Deva Bhava, Satyang Vada, Dharmang Chara. All of this is from the 11th Anuvak. And in the 12th Anuvak, the student responds. So it's like the pledge that you take at the end of the convocation. Again, you're familiar with those words, except you might not know where they are from. Sahana avatu, sahana bhunaktu, sahavirjam karavavahai, tejasina adhitumastu, ma vidvitshavahai. All of this is the students responding. I think there is a metaphor there. And the metaphor, Taittiriya, because they learned in the form of Tittira birds, the partridge. I think there is a metaphor there that you learn from everyone. Today is not the end of learning. You continue to learn. You learn from Tittira's partridges, you learn as you go out in the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, unless I am wrong, the student festival of ISI Kolkata is called Integration. And the student festival of ISI Bangalore is called Chaos, unless I am wrong. And that's a metaphor for what is going on, because plagues, epidemics throughout the world have happened through cross-border human movements. So the integration is part of that, and the resultant chaos is also part of that. Dharmang Chara. We are not talking about dharma in the sense of moksha dharma, metaphysics, spirituality, the other world, which is the reason the word dharma is very difficult to translate into English. Ignoring aspects of metaphysics, dharma is what we do in our daily lives as we see fit. There is a section in the Mahabharata which is called Apath Dharma. Dharma in time of calamities. And in some sense, what we confront today, because of the COVID and resultant outcomes, is like Apath Dharma, which are deviations from normal templates of dharma, not only for the king, the counterpart of today's government, but also for individuals. Because you go out in the midst of this uncertainty, I will not say, may you get what you want, because you won't. Instead, as a benediction, I will say, may you want what you get. May you find that dharma inside you. Two words are often used. One is shuk, or in Bengali shuk, happiness. And the other one is shanti, which is peace. The two are not the same. Quite often when we look for sukh or happiness, we are looking for sukh or happiness in terms of external objects, external relationships, transient objects, temporary objects. The shanti, the serenity is inside you. And as the Bhagavad Gita says, ashantasya kutah shukham. If you do not have that serenity inside you, you will not get happiness. So at some point, I hope you will reflect and find that destiny inside you, find that serenity inside you, find that dharma inside you, find that learning inside you, and find that destiny inside you. Finally, in conclusion, particularly this is because this is Kolkata, I cannot resist quoting or paraphrasing a bit from Swami Vivekananda's Swadesh Mantra, translated into English as Modern India. I don't really have to translate, so I'm stating it in Bengali. The meaning is obvious, and I'm paraphrasing a bit. He Bharat, ei poranubad, ei poranukaron, ei poromukhapekkha, ei dasashulab manushikata, ei mata sambol koriya tumi bishe uchcha padadhikar লাভ করিবে, and towards the end, হে গৌরীনাথ, হে জগদম্বে, আমার দুর্বলতা, আমার অক্ষমতা দূর করো, আমায় মানুষ করো. That is the future that you are headed towards. In Dante's Divine Comedy, there is a description of going through 9 concentric circles of hell, going to purgatory and then reaching paradise. Purgatory has the notion of purging. The Sanskrit word, the Indian word, tapas, is sometimes translated as austerities. It does not, the word austerities does not capture the nuance of scorching, heating, purifying. The world, India, all of us individually are going through this process of purification. You also face that. Nonetheless, as you pass through this portal, there is a great future waiting for you. And always remember, the burden of being a graduate of ISI will always be on your shoulders.
A very warm welcome to all of you to the 55th Convocation of the Indian Statistical Institute. We are delighted and honored that 2 very eminent persons have agreed to inspire our graduating students today, albeit through their recorded messages. Dr. Swaminathan has been the Director General of ICMR and the Secretary of the Department of Health Research in the Government of India. She is now the Chief Scientific Officer at the World Health Organization, which is at the center of the international management of COVID-19. Professor Peter Bickel of the University of California at Berkeley is one of the most outstanding statisticians of our times.
Pleasure to return to the Indian Statistical Institute after 40 years. My last encounter here was on C.R. Rao's 60th birthday, I believe. I've had ties to India before that, and after that, of course. I shared an apartment with Ashok Mitra, who later became director of the ISI. And I also had 2 wonderful students from the ISI, Shamini Bhattacharya and Shumendu Mukherjee. What I'd like to do is to present my view of statistics through my rather long life by now, and show you again how, in my eyes, it's evolved. So to begin with, there always have been 2 views of statistics. One as a mathematical science, and the second as a data science. The first, mathematical science, was basically what the emphasis was on during most of my career. Now I would say the emphasis is more on statistics as a data science. Actually, even at that time, there were different emphases at different times in different places. So in the United States, on the East Coast, Harvard and other places emphasized the data science. On the West Coast, I would say Stanford and Berkeley both emphasized theory. In India, I would say theory also was emphasized. In the UK, data science was definitely the dominant aspect. Well, okay, so as a mathematical science, I would say I've sort of arbitrarily divided it into three parts. First of all, a part which was long before I was born, and that was before 1900. And in that case, there was theory. In fact, the framework of probability theory developed, but it was inspired by data. So in the 18th century, you had Bernoulli, Laplace, and Bayes. In the 19th century, you had Quetelet in the social sciences, and Galton and Pearson in both to some extent. But there were many other figures. For example, Gauss played an important role in developing the method of least squares. If you're interested in this, I suggest you look at a wonderful book by Steve Stigler, The History of Statistics Before 1900. Now, the past, which of course covers part of my life, from 1900 to 1980. And I would say that the major figures were, of course, Fisher, who introduced the notions of population models, likelihood, and much else, followed by Neyman and Wald, who brought in the notions of decision theory, optimality. Of course, again, there were many, many more things happening. Fisher introduced, in addition to population models and likelihood, introduced the notion of ANOVA, experimental design. Wald introduced the idea of sequential analysis. There are also many other people during and after World War II. C.R. Rao, of course, Hotelling, Tukey, Robbins, Höfting, Stein, Lehman, Lacombe, Anderson, Cox, and Bartlett, for example, and many more that I've undoubtedly missed. The data part, I would say, is also in the past now. I'm not going to talk about the period before 1900, was also different. Most of the data was survey, economical, and public policy data, agricultural data, some medical data, some technological data. The general features of this data were bodies of data were in general small, and the data structures were relatively simple. Now, again, I always have to emphasize that there was much more going on. For example, you might say that probability theory was basically prompted by gambling. Astronomy played a big role in the starts of statistics. And also, as far as small bodies of data, well, there were censuses, insurance data, clinical trials from the 1930s. So there was always more going on. In the theory, again, now in the past, which is up to 1980, the emphasis was on parametric models. One sample, two sample, linear models, log linear models, exponential models, exponential distributions and models, in particular in the context of life and survival analysis. The notion of parameter, by the way, was introduced by R.A. Fisher, actually. And the whole notion of looking at statistics on the basis of a sample from a population and having a parameter which characterized the probability distribution of the population, that again really came primarily from Fisher. It's interesting to think back how unclear things were compared to the present. Of course, the present will presumably look unclear to the future also. Now, as far as the model's motivation goes, treatment versus control, of course, in, let's say, agricultural trials, regression, categorical data, like in the lady tasting tea, if you want, of Fisher, reliability data, time series data. The classes of probability distributions whose members formed the parametric models and were believed to generate the data, they could be described by low-dimensional Euclidean parameters, which involved the usual suspects as far as probability distributions goes: multivariate Gaussian, multinomial, logistic, exponential, and Poisson. Why? Largely as a matter of mathematical convenience and applicability. Also, really part of that period, certainly even from the very beginning, were the idea of non-parametric models and implicitly semi-parametric models. And these are obtained by sort of dropping the assumptions, right? You don't assume that things are necessarily Gaussian in a linear model. On dependence between covariates and response, so you don't assume that the responses are necessarily linear. And of course, on independence between the observations. You can assume, you can look at time series. Now, you cannot drop all assumptions. That's something I used to remember one of the first things I used to say in my theory classes, that the only form of data in which there are no assumptions is that you have n observations which have some joint distribution. And from that, you can't get anything. Now, non-parametric really means that you have an IID sample from one or more populations. Semi-parametric, I will talk about a bit later. Now, the questions that were considered very much were of three types: testing, estimation, and confidence regions. And the emphases of also on what was asked about procedures was on optimality in various ways. Bayes optimality, which was relatively simple if you had a Bayes prior. The decision theoretic point of view, where you start to get more things like minimax and unbiasedness. And in all of these, an important factor was to somehow measure model-based variability. Again, this was sort of limited. There were prediction tolerance regions, sequential methods were also discussed. Bayes was a catch-all. It included subjective Bayes, but it also included empirical Bayes, mixture of Bayes and frequentist and so on. Even robustness, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, came about very early. So, for example, in the 18th century, trimmed means were used to characterize average yields of wheat, let's say, in France. And then, of course, there was always the issue of simplicity. If things were not simple, you couldn't understand them. So, as I said, the approaches involved exact distributions insofar as possible. Fisher spent a good bit of time deriving the T distribution. The F distribution was actually, I think, also involved others. However, it was very clear that exact distributions could not be obtained in many cases, and very quickly the focus was on asymptotic methods as the sample size tended to infinity, but these were viewed as approximations. So, for example, to say that n is when you never get to n equals infinity, of course you never get to n equals infinity, but as an approximation, the expression could be perfectly valid and good enough. Now, I like to think of my own career as sort of split in a funny way, thinking of asymptotics. So I started out looking at second-order asymptotics, which were approximations to order 1 over n of distributions. Then I moved to first-order asymptotics, which is what most people looked at, where you have limit laws with scale 1 over the square root of n. But now, and at least in the recent past, I've focused on zeroth-order asymptotics, which is, the critical thing is bias, because the model is undoubtedly not correct. Now we move to the present. So in the present, data has changed in scale primarily. And why has it changed? Because we have computers and sensors. The computers mean that you have easy storage, you can gather the data, you can process the data in very large amounts. You can have large bodies of data. Sensors are, in fact, what are used to gather the data. You have things like, at Berkeley, for a while, it was, people talked about smart dust, which were little tiny sensors which would sort of send messages to central stations. Then you have more common things which we don't necessarily think of as sensors, like tomography, which again produces large, very complicated data sets. Social data, which was always present, but again is ballooned. And finally, you have enormous amounts of data coming, for example, from the human genome, where you have 3 billion base pairs. But then, of course, these are described in terms of all sorts of things called omes. There's the genome, of course, but there's a transcriptome, and there's the metabolome, and all of these add complications and structure to the data. They're always complex data structures. The theory has, because of that, really, since nobody really has a very clear idea of how to try to describe these in any very, very compact and simple way. It's focused on non and semi-parametric models, but the probability spaces that one thinks about are very complex, like random distributions on images, or represented in terms of probability distributions on high-dimensional function spaces. And the methods have mirrored the models. You have neural nets, reinforcement learning, and all sorts of different learnings, if you want, which involve huge data sets and very complex procedures for analyzing. The questions or the emphases have changed very much. Perhaps the most striking difference in emphasis has been on prediction. And the advantage of prediction is that it is possible to somehow validate your methods without somehow gathering new data necessarily, or having new data handy, without running new experiments. And of course, it's become very important commercially, because the prediction has become a mainstay of most technological companies. The criteria, the decision theoretic, but again, the emphasis on new data. Another emphasis has been on multiple comparisons. You want to make many conclusions from the same data, since there's so much of it, and many decisions are made simultaneously, and so you have to think about multiple comparisons. Then an old issue has become emphasized, the issue of causation. We've always focused on correlation between variables, but in fact, of course, what we really want is causation. As Hume showed a long time ago, you cannot actually prove causation, but in practical terms, you can try to intervene and to extrapolate and have useful results. And then again, a completely new thing, an emphasis on convergence of algorithms, because now methods are described in terms of usually iterative algorithms. And the optimization theory has played a role in these as well. Now, the approaches have also apparently changed. There are now, for example, non-asymptotic guarantees, which are basically worst-case bounds for the situation as you've modeled it non-parametrically. And these guarantees are on statistical properties, decision theoretic, but also on algorithm performance and convergence. Now, what is non-asymptotic? All it is asymptotics with worst-case constants specified. To do asymptotics, you have to have bounds. But the constants have been long known to be useless because they're too big. But the structure of the bounds give clues to the importance of the ingredients, the sample size, the dimension, and now, of course, tuning constants. The other big new aspect, if you want, again coming from the computer, is Monte Carlo and all sorts of things based on Monte Carlo, and combined with that is the idea of sample splitting as being crucial. Again, you can only do that when you have very large samples. All right, I'd like to now also talk a little bit about my view of the future. Probability has already moved to the center of mathematics, which it was not when I started. There were probabilists in math departments, but they were usually on the fringes. Now, there have been field medals which involve probability theory, and what's also happened is that there are very strong interactions with statistical physics and with theoretical computer science. In statistics, the strong interactions of probability have continued, but there are also other parts of data science. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, data structures, all of these play a big role. Computational issues have arisen, as I mentioned before, and skills are intrinsic. Construction of algorithms, convergence of algorithms, computation time. And finally, and what I found most interesting, are the appearance of strong interactions with substantive fields in almost all areas. To summarize, statistics in the past was small, and at the present it's large and complex. I might also mention passing, I mentioned statistical physics in connection with probability theory, but of course it's also had a big impact on statistical practice, because the most successful algorithms of statistics, the Gibbs sampler, the Metropolis algorithm, mean field methods, all came from statistical physics. So that's a course that should have been included in my education and wasn't. Now, what are hot theory areas? Because I would guess that most people at the ISI will go in that direction, though not all. Large complex data sets, as I mentioned. analyzing deep learning phenomena. For example, the possible disappearance of sparsity as an issue in prediction. Now, what is sparsity? Sparsity has appeared as a way of dealing with very high dimensional data sets with very high numbers of parameters. Basically, whenever you try to fit those naively, you get what's called overfitting, which means that you basically are fine with the data you have, but worthless at prediction. However, it turns out that neural nets behave in funny ways, and overfitting seems to be much less of a problem. A starting point for this study is videos of lectures at various programs in the Simons Institute, which you can look at online. The second aspect, which is far less settled, is interpretable conclusions from methods achieving excellent prediction. The methods which achieve excellent prediction are things like deep learning and so on, which basically achieve good prediction or excellent prediction, but without really understanding why. There's also present smallish data sets, and that's where, if you want intermediate data sets, where causation issues play a role. And finally, there's a general point I would like to stress, that theory is combined with practice for large data sets in many fields, in particular in one which I've gotten very interested in my later years, molecular biology. When you work on part C, so to speak, what you need is to learn the language and share the interests of the people in the substantive science that you're working with. Now, let me just briefly pause and talk about what you should gain from your studies in statistics. Of course, you will gain models and techniques in mathematics and data analysis. You will also, and that's a very important point, make friends to collaborate with and otherwise. But perhaps the major thing is something that should come to you already, and if it hasn't, you should learn it, is how to think statistically, which means that you accept randomness in formulating models and ideas. You want to realize and analyze the dependence of your conclusions on your assumptions. And finally, you want to measure uncertainty in some way without forgetting dependence on assumptions. These are philosophical issues as much as statistical. And I actually hit them rather early on in my a major applied paper, my only paper in science, towards the start of my career. How it occurred was accidental, but let me just mention it. There's a paper on sex bias in graduate admissions, where it appeared from a simple analysis of male-female acceptance denial ratios in the university that there was considerable bias in favor of males. However, admissions at Berkeley are done department by department. And then when people started to look for the guilty departments, they couldn't find any. And the reason was, in some sense, you could view it as a purely theoretical one. There's a tremendous difference between independence and conditional independence. So there was conditional independence, but not independence. Why? Because it turned out at that time, women were going to the departments which were hard to get into. You have a bright future, I think, in statistics, in academia, statisticians, data scientists, computer scientists, the social sciences, economists, psychologists, business school, public policy, sociology, anthropology, in the biosciences, molecular biology, genetics, integrative biology, neuroscience, epidemiology, biostatistics, in the engineering and physical sciences, even in history and philosophy. There are, of course, very much closer relations to industry than there were in the past, with partial or full positions in tech companies and finance. The key point to draw from this long list is that labels will not matter much, that's one. And the other, which is not so apparent from this, is that work is now very much done in teams. And now, finally, having gone over this very quick view of my views and to some extent my life, I wish you all good luck.
May I now request the director to start presenting the award of degrees and diplomas.
Sir, I have the honor to present before you the candidates for the degree of Master of Science in Quantitative Economics on their having completed the prescribed course of training at the Institute and having passed the qualifying examination, and pray that they may be admitted to the degree of Master of Science in Quantitative Economics.
By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Council of the Indian Statistical Institute, I confer on you the degree of Master of Science in Quantitative Economics in recognition of your having completed the prescribed course of training and having passed the qualifying examination, and charge you that in thought, word, and action you show yourselves worthy of the degree.
Ashish Gaurav,
I declare the 55th convocation of the Indian Statistical Institute closed.
I know this video stretched a long amount of time, but this was important and a lot of you guys might have got a lot of value out of it. So if you like this video, thanks a lot for watching it entirely and coming till this point. So if you have reached till this point, why don't you like this video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because in this channel we will talk about statistics, economics and anything and everything related to mathematics. Bye bye.